We start the episode with laughter. It's Debbie Gilbert here from the Business Awards show. And I'm also the founder of the Best Business Women Awards. And you're going to be in for a treat for the next 30 minutes. I'm with Donna Eade, who is a podcaster and a podcast expert and a podcast mentor. And we're going to have a really good chat about all things podcasting and also about an event that she's got coming up, which is going to be truly amazing, celebrating 5 years of her podcast. She's also won awards. She's won 5 Shining Star Awards, so 3 silvers and 2 golds. And her podcast has actually won awards as well. So welcome, Donna.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So it's a bit nerve-wracking interviewing someone on your podcast who is a really accomplished podcaster, because I would put that, to you that you are a very accomplished podcaster.
Oh, thank you.
So let's talk a bit about that, because you were a photographer and then you got into podcasting yourself, started a podcast. And from that, a couple of years ago, you started supporting other people to start their podcasts. So let's go back to the beginning of podcasting. What made you start a podcast? I'm really interested to know.
So for me, I have been listening to podcasts since 2014. My first podcast was an episode of Amy Porterfield's. She had Jasmine Star on. Jasmine Star, for those of you who don't know, used to be a very big wedding photographer. So I knew her from that. And she said she was being on this podcast. And I was like, I must listen, because I wanted to consume everything she did. And then I got hooked on those. And I've been listening to Amy Porterfield since like episode 42. And if you've heard any of her recent numbers, there's like 700 and something I think she's on now. So I've been listening to her for a long time. And when I decided to start my business, I knew that I needed a pillar content. And I didn't want to blog, because when I was a wedding photographer, I blogged and I struggle with the keyboard. I am what I coin keyboard dyslexic. My brain or fingers work faster than the other, and I spell things wrong all over the place. Give me a pen and my spelling's fine. So I thought, what can I do? I didn't want to be camera ready every day or every week or whatever. So I wanted to be able to just do it, get it done, and not worry about it. And so I thought, well, why don't I start a podcast? So I launched a business that was to help support wedding vendors and couples. It was called the Society of Professional Wedding Vendors. And I started it in 2020. And we all know what happened to the wedding industry in 2020. So I started my business and my podcast at the same time. I did it all wrong. I had no audience. I had no idea what I was doing. I just put it up there and hoped for the best. I didn't do a launch. I didn't have a big list to send it to or anything like that. But as I started, it became a way of me supporting the industry that I loved so much. So that's how it started. And then over the years, I realized that that business wasn't going to work. And I started getting people asking me, how do you start a podcast? And if there's anything that I've learned from Amy Porterfield, Stu McLaren, and all of Marie Forleo, it's like, what do people ask you about? That's what you want to do your business around. So that's when I transitioned into helping people launch their own podcasts.
I love that. And I love the fact you've been really transparent that it didn't go quite well to begin with.
Yeah.
I mean, your podcast is called Mindset and Action.
Yeah.
So talk us through a bit about what it's about. I mean, who are your ideal guests and what do you discuss?
So for me, when I transitioned out of it being a wedding podcast, I still wanted it to be able to support business owners, because that's like, I'm a huge supporter of business owner. I love people succeeding. I want to see people succeed. So I still wanted it to have that help, and I wanted it to still be relevant to the wedding industry. I didn't want to just abandon them. So I looked at what I had been mindful of in my wedding podcast, which was that I really wanted to help them with the business side of things, the things that they don't do so well because they're too busy doing what they love, which is making cakes and taking photos and doing dresses and all of that jazz, and do the admin side of business. So that just nicely transitioned into me opening it up to everybody else with Mindset and Action. So one of the big components is obviously mindset. I think if we don't have the right mindset, it doesn't matter if we're doing everything right, it can still fail because we've got that block in our minds. And then the action part is the other stuff that I talk about. So it's audience building, it's productivity and planning. And it's a lot of stuff that it might not be the most attractive stuff. It might not be the most exciting stuff. It's not the sales and things like that, but it is the stuff that keeps the business ticking over. And I think it's important that we learn to grow and streamline our businesses. And that is the tagline of the podcast, grow and streamline your business. So any business owners that are looking to grow and streamline, that is who I'm talking to. And then my guests tend to be experts around that. But I'm also going to be talking more to just general business owners, talking to them about how they handle those 4 areas in their business and what tips they can share. So I'm opening it up a bit this year.
Now, how many episodes are you in now?
So we have just, as today as recording, we have just recently dropped episode 294.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. And your podcast is 5 years old, coming up, and you've decided to do something a bit unique because I've not actually heard of anyone doing a podcast birthday party, but that's what you're doing. So tell us a bit about that event. That sounds
I'm
right.
so excited. So it's a big achievement to get 5 years into a podcast. So the stats for your listeners are that 90% of people who start a podcast will stop podcasting at episode 3. And of the 10% that carry on, 90% of those will drop off by episode 21. So if you reach episode 22, you're actually part of the 1% of podcasters, which is really exciting when you get there. And then for me, I was just like, 5 years, that's an achievement, especially given the transitions I've been through. The fact that the first business that I started in lockdown wasn't a success, but I continued to do the podcast and I continued through that. And I've been consistent throughout. There's only been 1 week that I think I've like properly missed in the whole of that time that hasn't been a planned break. And I've absolutely loved it, and I wanted to celebrate that. I wanted to do something that brings brought it into the real world. So I've got listeners out there that I don't know, and you'll have the same. People that you don't know are listening to your podcast, and I wanted an option to bring them into my world in real life and to actually be able to say thank you to them in person, and to also bring them some really great speakers. And have like a live podcast all day long, just where I'm there with a guest. We're going to be talking about the pillars of the podcast, and it's going to be fantastic. I'm really excited.
So it's going to go out live, those discussions.
Yeah, so we are going to, I'm looking into the possibility of being able to record them. Going to let my other half's tech person, I'm going to let him sort that out with the tech guy at the venue and make sure that we can do that, fingers crossed. But we will basically be doing 5 live podcasting sessions with guests on those 4 pillars. And I've got a very, very special guest. I know you know her. I'm sure your listeners know her as well, Diane Watson. She's going to come and talk to us about money, because if there's one thing on my podcast that hits really hard, it's the money topic. And last year, my top 3 listened to podcasts were all about money. So I'd be stupid not to listen to that and bring in the expert again and talk about money. So we've got the 4 pillars and money, and then I will also be doing an episode, a section on podcasting. So if anybody is interested in knowing more about podcasting and how it happens and what you need to do and why it might be of a benefit and things like that, I'll be talking about that. And then I've got 2 very special surprise cat sessions, I'm calling them, but you'll have to come to find out what they are.
Are you bringing Twinkle the cat along?
No, I don't think she would be too up for it. She's a bit too sleepy for that. No felines are involved, but I did say you will get the same benefit of petting a cat from these sessions. So it's very exciting.
Before we went on to recording this, we talked about how long people listen to a podcast episode for. And that was quite an interesting stat that you threw at me. You said 80% of people will listen to the end, provided it remains to be your kind of standard format of about 30 minutes or what they're accustomed to.
Yeah.
So that makes me think, how closely should people who are running a podcast look at their stats?
I think it's really important to be aware of your stats. Now, in the podcasting world, because of the way it's done, it can be very difficult to draw, huge accuracies from your downloads and things like that, because at the end of the day, your podcast is going out on multiple directories and they don't all feed back to your host in the same way, and it can get a little bit confusing. So it's always a little bit of a take it with a pinch of salt. But the standard, and I think this is probably comes from Apple because they do have listener percentage on their stats, that 80% of people will listen to the entire episode. So when you're looking at your stats and you're seeing that 100 people have listened to your last episode, you can pretty much guarantee that 80 of those people listened to the entire thing. And that's really important information to know, because oftentimes in podcasting, our call to action is at the end. And it happens with like videos and things like that. But people will say, oh, don't leave it till the end because nobody's going to hear it. Nobody listens to the end. But with podcasting, it's different. So you've got that added benefit of that retention rate on your guests listening. So 80% are going to listen to the end, which means if you put a call to action at the end, 8 out of every 10 people that listen are going to hear it. And that's a useful thing to know.
Yeah, no, it is, because I've been listening to a few other podcasts recently, and one I would say is very similar to mine, not the same, but similar. And there is 3 times during the podcast an ad. I don't have any ads on my podcast. I've not really explored that. But personally, I think it's because I find it really irritating. I mean, I love Rob Brydon's podcast, but he has so many ads throughout his podcast. Um, everything from Indeed to, you know, I don't know, holidays, all sorts of things. And, I just find it really annoying. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that, because a lot of people think they can monetize a podcast directly, but actually I think it's a wider thing, monetizing your podcast. What's your thoughts on that?
The way I talk to my clients when I'm talking to them about monetizing their podcast is I always say start with what you sell first, especially as a business podcast. A little bit different when you're a comedian doing a show. It's like an entertainment value. Then they haven't got something to sell, although you could say tickets to their show. But, they haven't got that ability to sell directly on their podcast, whereas business owners have that opportunity. And so for me, I would rather build a consistent listenership, get that loyalty from my listeners, and sell them something that I am 100% behind, 100% know that it's worth them spending their money on, and retain that quality for them, rather than put in ads on my podcast. Now, podcast ads, there's limits to it. So you've got to get sort of at least 1,000 downloads in a month or something to even be like recognized to have ads on your podcast. And then it's what control do you actually have? Like, I've not gone into it myself to look, so I don't know what control you have about what ads show on your podcast. So it might be things that aren't aligned with you. HelloFresh, Indeed, holidays, all of these things are usually the ones at AG1 and things like that are all on there, but you might not be aligned to it and you might not have the control over what is actually shown in those ad spots. So for me, I prefer the selling what you do, and sponsorships is another way of bringing in extra revenue from your podcast. So, collaborate with a business buddy who does something that complements what you do, or just something that you truly believe in, that your audience will love, and get them to sponsor an episode or a couple of episodes, and do that rather than putting in those generic ads, which I completely agree with you. They annoy the heck out of me. And I literally don't listen to Jenna Kutcher's podcast, which is like one of the biggest podcasts in the business podcasting world. I don't listen to it because of all the ads.
Yeah, because there's also been this move that you could be a paid subscriber for no ads, but then you're paying. So it's all a bit strange. So if someone's sitting there and they've kind of like what we've been chatting about podcasting, and they're thinking, I've been thinking about doing this podcasting thing. Where on earth do they start with this? Because it is a very big topic, isn't it? But where would you suggest they start with their idea?
They start by listening to episode 294 that just dropped
Oh,
because that episode was 5 top tips to start a podcast in
oh, there you go.
2025.
That's easy.
So that's nice and easy. But for a tangible thing for them to take away now, it is to start with your strategy. What is the purpose of your podcast? Who are you aiming at? What is it for? What are you going to be talking about? And really sort of drill down into what that's going to look like. Because if you just want a podcast because it's the current in thing to have and all business owners are talking about it, so you better get on it now. If you don't go in with a strategy, it's going to fall flat. You're going to give up, and you're going to be part of that 99% that give up before episode 21.
So true, isn't it? I think a lot of people think it's a really easy thing to do, but actually, my personal view, it's not as easy as people think it is. And I guess that might be why I think there's two reasons probably why they give up. One is because it actually is a commitment. You know, I have to hive off several hours a month out of my calendar to do this. And then I have somebody that does all my podcast editing for me, does the show notes. We've got a website that maintains all of the episodes in one place, although you don't necessarily need that. So I think it's a commitment, isn't it? Would you say?
Yeah, it is a commitment, and podcasting at its core is easy. You know, if you've got a set of headphones like the Apple headphones that come with your phone, like wired headphones, and a laptop and the ability to record, you can create a podcast. Easy
Mm.
peasy. But making a good podcast that people want to listen to, that's going to
Yeah.
actually benefit your business, that's where the difference comes in. Like, I am huge on audio quality. It's one of my biggest bugbears when listening to an episode. I've got a friend that's got a podcast, and she does it in a really open office space, and it's
Mm.
so echoey, and it bothers me. I can't listen to it because it just doesn't sound good in my ears. So there are things that I think you can do that really improve your chances of a podcast doing well. And if you actually want to have it grow and things like that, there are lots of things to consider. Your SEO is really important, you know, for growth, making sure that you've got an audience, making sure you launch it well. There's lots of things to consider. So yeah, you could just slap a podcast up there in 5 minutes if you've got the ability to do a recording. But actually, it takes a lot more than that to actually do something that's worthwhile and is actually going to get you traction.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I like doing it because I'm really nosy. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to put that out there. That it's enabled me to talk to the people who've not only won my awards, but other awards, and also judges and sponsors and people who run other awards.
Mm,
You know, it's been really good to talk to them about their awards. And I'm just very nosy. And it's
yeah.
30 minutes of me fact finding and listening to what other people have been through with their business because I love listening to all of that. And I find it really inspiring because I sit there thinking, oh my God, that's really amazing, you know. And you sort of have your podcasts, I do mine on podcast recording days, and you sort of sit back and think, that's a really nice day I've had today because I've spent the whole day talking to people who've succeeded.
Yeah.
Um, Podcast awards, you know, again, we were chatting about this before we went on to record. There are some big podcast awards out there, aren't there? But
Yeah.
but what we were saying was there's a real lack of, like, you called it indie podcasts. I loved that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what did you mean by that when you said indie
So,
podcasts?
an indie podcast is a podcast that is run by somebody who is basically solo doing it all by themselves. So, it's not somebody who has a big media company. Like, you'll see a lot of like YouTube podcasters, and there's a whole thing about video podcasts, and I won't get into that, but you will see like they have the microphones that have the square boxes on that, like, say
Mm,
DM Media and things like that. Well, they're big media companies that are running them. But if you are, you know, a small business owner and you're doing it all yourself, and potentially you've got somebody to do your editing for you. I do all my own editing, but those sort of small companies that are creating podcasts, they're indie podcasts. And it's a bit like when you think of it as musicians, you know, an indie musician is somebody who isn't signed to a label, hasn't got a big background support there in the music industry, but is putting music out there. So it's the same thing for podcasts.
Interesting. Yeah, so we were saying there's not that many awards out there for small podcasting. And yet, you know, I think it comes back to the same thing that I always talk about with social media. It's about quality, not quantity. So you might only have a small audience, but if it's quality information that you're sharing that people are interested in, just because you haven't got masses and masses of downloads, I don't think it devalues it in my view. So interesting. And I might have to do a party next year because my podcast will be 5 years old.
Yay!
You might start a trend here. So let's go back to talking a bit about awards because this is the Business Awards show. Um, and you've got your 5 Shining Star Awards, and those awards really do celebrate you as a businesswoman and a support to other women.
Yeah.
So how has that helped power your business forward? Do you think that's added to the credibility of what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I have in my email footer, I've got that I'm a winner of the Best Business, the Shining Star Awards, and I've also got in there my podcast finalist award thing as well. So that goes in my email every week, so everybody always sees that, and it's on my website as well. And I think it is something that really, even external, because I'm not a big one, like I'm terrible with my PR. You know, I know you will be very upset with me, Debbie, but I know when you do the Shining Star Awards, you send out afterwards the, you know, the ability to do a press release to local media and things, and I never do it. So I'm missing a trick,
You
absolutely. I
are.
really
Amanda
am.
Fitzgerald would be hitting you on
I
the head with her
know.
microphone.
But for me, when I enter the Shining Star Awards, it's really an opportunity for me to look back on the last year and see how far I've come. Because one of the things that I'm absolutely terrible about is actually celebrating successes as they happen. I am very much like on to the next, on to the next, on to the next. What have I got to do next? And that means that by the time I get to the end of the year, I often feel quite burnt out and often feel like I haven't achieved anything. So filling in that awards really makes me stop and think about the year that I've had and what I've done in my business. And that just in itself, without the publicity, is so powerful because it enables me to then go, okay, so this is what I achieved. This is what didn't go so well, this is what went well, and then plan my next year based on that. So it really is that kind of anchor point for me to do my review and look at what I want to do in the next year. So I really love it for that purpose.
Yeah, so you're using it as a review thing. Um, so we talked about the event. Talk us through your podcast mentorship that you do, so people can understand how you can help them if they are thinking of starting a podcast.
So there's kind of 2 ways that I work with people at the moment. One of them is to help them start their podcast from scratch. So I have an 8-week program that I help people through, and that's actually coming out. Towards the end of this month. So we're going to be launching the DIY version. So if you don't really want my help, if you're more tech savvy and you just want to get on with it, do it yourself, you'll be able to do that. But then I have a continual enrollment where you can come and join me for 8 weeks and I will help you through it. So you'll get the same program, but we have calls. You have access to me through Voxer for any questions. And if you get stuck with tech, we can hop on a Zoom. So I help them with that. And that takes them right through from the idea through to publishing 3 episodes at the end of it.
Mm.
And it includes my launch ready strategy, which I'm really proud of because like I said, I did not launch my podcast properly the first time round. But when I relaunched it as Mindset in Action, I did do a launch, and I've actually done that with a couple of boot camps. And it has helped people and it helped me to get into the Apple charts with our podcast. So I'm really proud of that. So that gets included in that 8-week program. You can buy it separately on my website. And then the other way I work with people is podcast podcast audits, which have become really useful to people. So I've done a few of those recently, and I'm going to be publicising those more this year, where I just kind of have a look at your podcast. It's that extra set of eyes, somebody who's been podcasting for a long time, where I can sort of see things that maybe you haven't looked at because you're in the weeds, and I do a whole review and help you to find ways that you could perhaps improve it and make adjustments that just might, and show you things that you can test to see if it makes a difference and things like that.
I love that. So you could be someone listening to this that's got a podcast. They've maybe done a few episodes and then abandoned it. They could come and talk to you and restart it,
Yeah.
because I spoke to someone last year who'd done exactly what you'd said. She'd done a half a dozen episodes, was only getting about 20 downloads for each one, couldn't see the point, stopped doing it. But then a business coach had said, well, actually, you should restart it. So I had a conversation with her about something else and she happened to mention it. So if someone's in that situation, can they reboot and kick an old podcast that they abandoned back out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So a podcast, the great thing about podcasting is it's an evergreen piece of content. So
Mm,
even if you're not uploading, people will still listen to it. The podcast directories work like a search engine. So people will type in things that they're looking for and it will bring up podcasts. Obviously, if you're more active, you are more likely to show up because they want to show them that, the most
mm,
obvious pieces of content that are going to work for them. And if it's something 3 years ago versus something that was last week going to be more up to date, so they'll show them that. But it's evergreen content. So for me, I have another podcast called Mike Action Podcast. I did one series last year. I was supposed to do two, never got round to it, got too busy. And I was sitting there thinking, oh, I really should go and do series 2. And series 2 is going to be really easy because I've already got all the recordings for it. Just haven't got round to it. But yeah, absolutely. With the right launch in place, if you relaunch it, like when do a proper launch around it, you could totally just reboot it, keep those 6 episodes there, and move on from that
go
point.
for it.
I would
Yeah.
say there's no point in starting from
No.
scratch when you've already got all of that tech side of things set up. Just keep going. So yeah, absolutely, they could restart.
Great advice. Good. Well, I think you've shared a lot of information today and made people stop and think. Because I procrastinated over my podcast for quite a long time, probably about 2 years, because I'd written a book and a podcast seemed like the next logical thing. And I was actually digging around trying to find people talking about business awards, and there wasn't anybody. I
Mm,
found a podcast in Australia that had run for about 12 episodes and stopped. And so I worked with a company before you were doing what you're doing.
yeah,
I worked with Lindsay Gould, and because I knew if I didn't work with somebody that it would just be something that would sit on my list and I wouldn't get it done.
yeah.
And they launched it for me just as somebody else brought out a podcast about awards. But actually, interestingly, she stopped doing it. So it's quite interesting how, you know, the trajectory of podcasts goes, because there are more podcasts, I think, you know, that get started but don't actually, they end up in the podcast trash bin. I wonder what the
The
stats are on
graveyard.
that. How
Well,
many end up in the podcast trash bin?
so, well, 99% of them.
Yeah, but I wonder what that is in numbers. They
And
reckon
then,
there's
so
about,
there's around 5 million podcasts
right.
out there at the moment, and only around 250 to 350,000 are active podcasts, meaning that they've uploaded at least one episode in the last 12 months. Now,
Wow.
those stats might be a little outdated. I haven't checked them recently, but yeah, last time I checked, those were the kind of stats you were looking at. So 5 million podcasts
Have been
on the
registered. Yeah.
platforms, but only 250,000-ish are actually
It's a
active
huge
podcasts.
opportunity for people,
Yeah,
isn't there, to get
yeah,
their voice out there?
yeah. And that's exactly what you found, because if you'd have decided, oh, there's another podcast out there about awards, there's no point in
Mm.
me doing it, and you'd done what they did and stopped, then there would be no podcasts about awards, because if you stopped before her, And then she just stopped because maybe she,
Mm,
you don't know that she stopped because of you. She could well have
no.
stopped because it was too much work for her. She
Yeah.
didn't know what she was doing. She wasn't getting the downloads. There could be a number of things, and then there wouldn't be anything. So I'm always saying to people, like, podcasts, there are a lot of podcasts out there, but there are not a lot of active ones. And if you can get in and be consistent and stick
Yeah.
at it and still be around 5 years later, then you've got a real chance of making a difference in your niche on the podcasting platform.
Yeah, I'd agree with that because I think it took me quite a long time to get any traction on mine. I just kept going and going and going. Um, but it's a great tool for me as a business awards owner to be able to talk to my sponsors and say, look, I've got this podcast, come on. Or as I said to you earlier, just to be a bit nosy and find out more about people because I love understanding what makes people tick. And I've learned
Yeah.
a lot of business tips from all the guests that I've had over the years. So you have given me a little thought for next year. I think it was April, so it'll be April next year for me. It'll be 5 years ago. So thank you for joining me today. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. We've known each other now for quite some time, so
Wow.
it's been amazing. And Donna also runs my networking company, Business Women Unlimited. She runs the online networking group, which meets once a month, no membership needed. Very rarely plug that, you know. I need to plug it a bit more, don't I?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
so if you're listening to the podcast today, drop us an email at
Yeah,
Business
you want to
Women
come and meet me in
Unlimited.
person online,
Well,
then
meet you online, yeah. So you live in this
or
virtual
you can
world,
come to
Donna.
my event and meet me in person in
Yes,
real life and give me a
yes.
hug. But yeah, if you want to meet
Yeah,
me online, then come to my
definitely.
meeting.
And your event is where? We didn't mention
It
that, did we?
is at the Castle Theatre in Wellingborough, Northamptonshire, on the
Lovely.
3rd of April. And there
There
are
you go.
early bird tickets still available at the
Oh,
moment.
there you go, even better. So we'll drop all the details into the show notes. So if you're interested in getting support, starting a podcast, or attending Donna's 5th birthday event, which will be a great networking opportunity as well. And if you're interested in attending networking online, all those links will be put into the show notes. And if you're watching the video on YouTube, we'll put them into the description for you. So all that remains for me to say is thanks, Donna, for joining me today. As
Thank you
I
so much
said
for
to you
having
at the
me.
beginning, I'm not as professional as you, and I know it. It's all a bit chaotic here at the Business Awards show. It's a bit like just having a chat and a cup of tea with me, really. Um,
Absolutely.
so I hope you've enjoyed being here today. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to celebrating your 5th podcast birthday with you. So take care.